Hello, Janine, and welcome to my YouTube channel.
Hi.
Um, Hi, Janine and I connected through an email, and she was interested in sharing her story. So I'll just get into it. I haven't had an interview in quite some time, and I was just telling Janine I feel kind of rusty at this. It's been over a month. So, Janine, how did the Jehovah's Witnesses come into your life?
So, on both sides of my family, both of my parents became witnesses at a very young age. My mom's family lives here in Rochester, New York, and he was witness to in a parking lot in the middle of a blizzard. And he said, "Wow, this message must be really important if this man is sharing this with me on this, horrible day." And my mom had always been a spiritual person, even from a very young age. And I think, religion definitely spoke to her and as a person. And my dad's family, kind of similar story. They became witnesses when he was young. So kind of third generation on both sides. When it comes to like my cousins and my aunts and uncles, most of them are witnesses, but there's a good number that aren't and haven't been or never were witnesses. And kind of, it was interesting having, navigating relationships with family that were in and out of the religion. And one of the things I feel like witnesses kind of have a hard time with is maintaining those family bonds when there is no religion, in common. So I think, looking back on, my childhood, I wished we could have been a little bit closer and had closer ties to family that weren't witnesses, because now that I'm gone, I've kind of reconnected with that family. Growing up, I have two sisters. I'm in the middle, which, in all honesty, I think a lot of times, we talk about the forgotten middle child, but for me, it really worked out well for me in my life. I felt like I was able to kind of do my own thing and kind of run under the radar. I also left home first. I tend to be the more independent, adventurous one of the three of us. We all have vastly different personalities. So, when I became a teenager, my sister was going through a rough time and ended up getting disfellowshipped. And um, I remember at one point my parents were, said to me, "Oh, we're so happy that you're the one we don't have to worry about," which it sounds nice, but then it also means that you always have to be okay. You don't have the space to fall apart. You don't have the space to really, go through things. You just have to put on this mask of, I'm the okay one. I'm the okay one. And that has been basically the trend throughout, you know, my life when it comes through my relationship with my parents and, where I kind of fall and, with my sisters. I'm the okay one. And so, as I got older and I moved out of the house, I moved in with my mom's parents. Once I graduated high school, that was an interesting experience. My mom's mother, my grandmother, was not a very kind person, which, if anybody knowing her is watching this, that might be a surprise to you. But the way she treated her family and the way she treated non family was drastically different. And by looking at her, you would never know. And so I think that also made a really big impact on how I viewed witnesses and how witnesses treat people, where you kind of have this facade. And as long as the facade stays up, you're okay, you're revered. She was, both of my grandparents on my mom's side were very beloved. Um, the congregation here in Rochester started in their basement. So they were, considered witness royalty. So that was always interesting because it was like there was the woman that I knew that treated us so badly and treated my mom so badly. And then there's, other people that, worship the ground she would walk on. And so that was a very interesting experience. So I pioneered right out of high school. I didn't really have a choice. There was, really wasn't any other options that, I felt that I had. Obviously, like looking back, yeah, I could have done whatever I wanted to do, but that's the how cults work. You feel like you don't have a choice. And I did enjoy pioneering. I, had a lot of friends that were also pioneers. So you kind of have that like everybody kind of pushes everybody in, one direction. Um, of course, in my, late teens, early 20s, there were a lot of my friends that got disfellowshipped and left. But at that time, a lot of them were leaving because they got in trouble or, it was traumatic. It wasn't that they left on their own. And they, a lot of them did kind of crash and burn. So, looking back, I didn't leave until 2020, but, looking back, I kind of realized it kind of almost was a protection that I didn't leave right then because I feel like I wasn't prepared to make good life decisions. Um, so, I have like mixed feelings about, how long I stayed in. It's some days, oh, I wish I would have, left, when I was a teenager. And then there are other times I'm like, oh my God, thank God I didn't, I didn't leave, then. Um, After pioneering for a couple years, I decided to join foreign language. I joined the Russian and I think it was 2006, I think. And it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Um, it was a lot of fun to learn the culture. I really loved the language. I got to meet a lot of really nice people. Um, However, the hall I was in was extremely dysfunctional in every sense of the word. Um, I was physically assaulted in the Kingdom Hall um, by a fellow sister, and it was just the two of us, and so there was no recourse. I also was I got cornered by two Bible students in the coat room, and they started saying extremely explicit sexual things to me, and they actually were physically holding me back. And there was an elder and a minister, actually two elders, that were standing. I was like facing out and they were like blocking, they were facing me. And so I looked out and I saw them. And all I said was, can you help me, please? Please help, help. Because they were physically stopping me from leaving while they were saying all these vile things to me. And the two brothers just stood there and laughed. They thought it was hilarious. And even after I was able to I kind of basically like punched. I just like kept punching until I could get out. That was like the only way I could escape. And they also thought that was funny. And so that is just kind of a taste of what I experienced in Russian. Um, it, there was a lot of competition. I think foreign language sometimes can breed a lot of competition between like learning the language, who knows the language best, who is at the best Bible students, who's doing the most, who's going to such and such country, who's doing this, who's doing that. And I, by nature, am just not a competitive person, so I didn't really fit in to that. I'm if you want to win, congratulations, good for you. That's just my mindset. And I just didn't jive with the competitive nature in the hall. And um, I, one of the refuges at that point was work. I really enjoyed work. And around this time too is when I started really waking up, because up until this time there were bad things that had happened that I'd seen, um, and like different things that I knew others had experienced, but it still wasn't quite enough to like jolt me awake. So like a lot of other people, when they changed the generation teaching to this generation will never ever end. It just keeps going on and on and on. That was the first time I was like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm always a very logical person. And it just was like, okay, we talk about all different, the silent generation, the boomer generation, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. How are those all considered one generation? That just makes zero sense. And so slowly but surely, and then as I saw, organizational things, especially in the Russian hall and how that was handled, and dealing with the circuit overseers and things like that. I tried to get help, but I was a single sister, and I wasn't married. I wasn't part of, at this point, people knew who my grandparents were, but that wasn't really a protection for me at the point. So, like, nobody really listened to me and what my concerns and the struggles that I was having. So again, I just learned to be okay, and kind of keep it to myself. Um, and then in 2007, I decided to join French because I really couldn't handle it anymore. That was probably the closest I had got into leaving the witnesses, because being in Russian was just traumatic. In fact, there are a lot of things that I have forgotten about that like I'll be talking like, oh yeah, I forgot about that happened. So there's like big blocks of my memory that are they're just gone. And I think, honestly, it's my mind trying to protect itself. So I ended up joining French, which was honestly very healing. Um, I was still pioneering at the time, but I can laugh now. But when I was leaving Russian, I had kind of like I'm like, I don't want to pioneer anymore. And they convinced me to stay as a pioneer. They're like, well, we'll send you to French as a pioneer. And then once you go there, then you can decide. And so I said, okay, that makes sense. So I had joined French, and it was the day of the pioneer meeting with the elders. And so I show up, and one of the elders was like, why are you here? And I'm like, what do you mean, why am I here? I'm here for the pioneer meeting. He's like, you're not a pioneer. I'm like, what do you mean? Turns out Russian had deleted me as a pioneer, but didn't tell me. And so, of course, I'm standing there and I start crying. And he was very kind. The elder he was very, very kind, but he was very firm that I could not stay because I was not a pioneer. And so I left, and it was like at that point, I was like, I could leave and never come back. Um, but I knew if I did that, I would lose contact with my mom and my sisters. At this point, my dad had stopped becoming a witness. He was disfellowshipped when I was in my early 20s. He's kind of a whole nother story. Um, so he hasn't been in my life for a really long time. Um, but I did end up staying. French was a it was I had a lot of good I have a lot of good memories there. There was still, some of that competition, kind of like that kind of drama, but it was a lot less than there was in Russian, so that was very helpful. Throughout this time, I had become closer to some of my workmates and kind of gained friends outside of witnesses. Because growing up, in the town we grew up in and the school we went to, we were one of the only Black families for a really long time, and we were also witnesses. So I've been standing out and being the weird one my entire life. And so I got to a point where I'm like, I just want to be normal. I just want to be known as normal. I don't want to be, some crazy cult kid. I don't want to be, I just want to fit in. And so at work, I, kind of kept my whole witness life quiet. So I, definitely lived the stereotypical double life. I had my witness life, and then I had this other life that I was creating for myself because I felt like I needed an outlet, especially with, when I was in Russian, I needed something outside of that, because that, when you're in foreign language, that's basically your whole life, and there's small groups. So you don't have the variety that you do in English halls. So I became friends, and then I, basically acted like I wasn't a witness. I started celebrating holidays. I had my first birthday party. They had no idea it was my first birthday party. It felt wonderful, to be celebrated, because again, middle kid, pretty much, you fly under the radar. What middle kid? So it was nice, feel special, and to kind of get to have people that wanted to be in my life and liked me for me, and not because some religion told them they had to. That, friendship out of obligation, whether you really connect with somebody or not. I gained some really good friends that I'm still friends with to this day that really have, they've saved my life. And a lot of them had no idea I was a witness. Some of them don't even know that that was the cult I was in. I kind of just kept it ambiguous, like when I woke up in 2020 and kind of, or when I left in 2020, and kind of had this, entire thing happen to me. I was like, okay, maybe I need to share, a little bit. So basically I would just say, oh, I, was in a cult, but I, never really disclosed the name or, everything that, entailed in that. Cause again, I just wanted to be normal. So I, kind of slowly but surely, you know, was closer to, what I consider my real friends that really liked me. And then at the time, my younger sister had gotten married to a brother in Tanzania, and she was living there, and my mom was living there too. And so, as much as I really wanted to leave witnesses, I still was worried about them being overseas and being cut off from them. And then, of course, when COVID happened, my mom happened to be in India, and um, she had some trouble getting back. She kind of got stuck there. And again, I was kind of like, I don't want to leave until I know she's safe, because there was a lot of question of whether she would be able to come back, and her safety was also in question. So, but once everybody was back stateside, I basically sent a text. I sorry, but I don't want to be a witness anymore, and I love you all, but basically saying goodbye. I did end up disassociating, mainly for one reason and one reason only. I did not want anyone to contact me. I know, like, some people say, oh, that's playing by their rules, or, you can fade and still keep the contact. But I knew I did not want someone trying to convince me, of making, basically saying, like, I don't have the wherewithal to make decisions for my life. And I'm like, at the time I was 35 years old. If I can sign a lease, you know, buy a house, buy a car, decide what I'm going to do for work, I can decide what I want to believe. And I did not want anyone trying to convince me otherwise. Um, so I had sent an email to two elders and basically said, I don't want to be a witness anymore. I don't want to be known as a witness anymore. And I thought that that was going to be sufficient, because I actually looked at the elders manual, and it's like, basically they need written proof. And they'd asked if I wanted to meet with them, and I really didn't want to, but they kind of made it sound like I had to, like, make it official. Looking back, I didn't need to meet with them. And honestly, if anything, that meeting made it crystal clear that I had made the right decision, because in that meeting they basically said, well, what about your nephew? My older sister has a son. Well, what about your nephew? You're going to, lose contact with him. Why don't you stay for your family? And I was like, but that's wrong. Staying for somebody else is wrong. I'm telling you, I don't believe this anymore. Why are you trying to convince me to stay for somebody else? I'm like, that's just wrong. And they, kept begging and pleading. They're like, when was the last time you studied? When was the last time you prayed? And honestly, at that point, it had been a really, really long time, because I hadn't believed in, you know, probably 8 years, once I lost all of my faith, in, witness doctrine. And I think, looking back, I am kind of glad I had such a long waking up period, because by the time I left, I had the strength and fortitude to really put my foot down, and say, no, I'm leaving. I don't believe this anymore. And I also had a support structure. Of course, with COVID, everything was like locked down. And it was, officially losing my family was traumatic. And it was kind of, um, there was a lot of mental turmoil at that time, on top of COVID. Um, but a lot of those days and months and weeks, I started doing yoga pretty much every day, a couple times a day, lots and lots of meditation. Um, I worked in the hospital system, so work was extremely busy. But I was also furloughed for a little over a month. So I took that month and basically just it was basically month long meditation of, what do I believe? Who am I? Those basic fundamental questions that, as witnesses, you never ask yourself. They're told to you, they're dictated to you. What do you believe? You read it in a book. What do you think about the future? You read it in a book. You see pictures. Who are you as a person? They tell you who you are as a person. What do you like? What are your interests? They tell you these things. You don't get to decide that for yourself. And so it was almost like I felt like I was like, at ground zero, and got to decide, who am I? What do I actually believe? And a lot of it was, I don't know yet, and being okay with not knowing. Because my entire life, I had concrete belief in God, I had concrete belief in the future, I had concrete belief that I potentially could never die. And so speaking of death, I went through a period where I was obsessed with death and dying. Um, and because for so long, they tell you, you're not going to die. The chances are you're going to make it through the Great Tribulation. So, coming to grips with my own mortality was also kind of a shock. And even though I had woken up, there is a difference of when you wake up and you're still kind of tied to the mothership a little bit. But once you really break that, break that bond, you really do kind of change as a person. I think there's a lot of change that you can do while you're still um, physically and mentally out, but there is a difference being physically out and mentally out, um, as a whole. Um, so it was an interesting time. I don't ever want to go through that again. um, but I can look back on it now with really with fondness, because in that time I really, if any of my friends are watching this, you saved my life. Um, and so I really got to know like who my friends are and who really has my back, because for so long it was like, oh well, witnesses are your best friends, there, and it's like, no, they weren't. If I had this monumental change, they were gone. And here were these, other people that really didn't know what I was going through, but they loved me as a person enough to like stick by me. Sorry. um, so like still like that's the part that, really makes me emotional, because for the first time it was like I felt like I really understood what friendship was, because I think as witnesses, like they tell you, oh, these are your best friends, these are, the only people that will really love you. And that's simply not true. It's such a conditional love, it's such a conditional friendship, it's conditional family bonds. It's like if you can break a family bond over, simply deciding, your belief structure, which doesn't change you fundamentally as a person, then what is that? So I feel very, very extremely lucky that I was able to make friends before I left, because they really, really rallied around me. Because at that time I started sharing more and more about, my family and, my past, because I felt safe to. I think, as a witness, you realize a lot of, if you have doubts, you have no outlet. It's not safe to share, because if you start sharing doubts, that you're going to be hauled in, to the back room. And um, I have a lot of deep philosophical conversations with people, and we remain friends. We have vastly different, beliefs in God and Scripture and what happens when we die. What's the afterlife? Was there anything before this? We, have vastly different, a lot of differences, but we can still be friends and respect each other. And it just, I'm I'm just so thankful for my life now. And looking back, I, like I said before, sometimes I wish I would have left sooner. I turned 40 this year, so it's like, oh, I'm really, middle age, but if I would have left before, I wouldn't have the support structure that I have now. So I'm right where I'm right where I'm supposed to be. So I think that's it in a
Janine,
nutshell.
thank you so much for sharing all of that. Happy birthday. You said you just turned
Thanks.
40 this month?
I turned 40 in March.
In March. Well, happy early
Yeah.
birthday.
Yeah. Thanks.
I have a couple questions. How did you get into Russian out of all the languages out there? I mean, Russian is, I mean, I know that there's plenty of Russian speaking congregations in the US,
Mhm.
but Russian before French, and did you learn Russian in high school? Like, and then French right after? Like, are you just really easy at picking up languages? Because I sure as heck am not. And I know that some people have just a knack at picking up languages. So was that something that you already had acquired in school, or what happened?
My mom, she dictated a lot of what we wanted to do with our lives, and what our aspirations should be. And one of her fond memories was being in Spanish. So when we were kids, her thing was always, you're going to pioneer and you're going to do foreign language. And so I had taken 4 years of French in high school, and I absolutely loved the French language. Um, and here in Rochester, there really wasn't, at that time when foreign languages were really, becoming the thing. There French wasn't one of them. Um, but I still kind of I studied in French. I still listened to French music. I still, tried to keep up my language skills. And at the time, my roommate was Romanian and had started kind of working with and the Russian group was in the English hall that I was in. And because I was pioneering at the time and they were most of the pioneers, I ended up with them a lot. So, of course, if I'm in service, I want to be able to say something. So, I learned the alphabet. When they had the Russian class, they would study at our house. I would cook dinner for everybody and I would hold the flashcards. So I kind of, learned, and then it was like, well, I really like this. I really, like Eastern European people. They're beautiful people. And here in Rochester, there's not a whole lot of Russians, but there's a lot of Ukrainians. And so I, got to learn, about the cultures, and we would go downstate for our assemblies and conventions, and that was always a really fun time. um, and so it was kind of, I still wanted to do French. French was always in the back of my mind. And then, of course, like halfway through, while I was in Russian, they were like, oh, we're going to start a French group. But at that time, I had really invested a lot of time and effort because Russian is not an easy language. Um, it is, the grammar is ridiculous. I love it. I still love the language. I say a lot of times English is not sufficient. There's not enough words, whereas Russian there are too many words. It's just a very specific language, so that really spoke to me. Um, but once the French became was going to be, it was, definitely they were going to become a congregation, and then with all of the issues that were happening in Russian, I was like, okay, it's time to leave. So that's, so I kind of went back to French.
Got it.
um
And how long
yeah.
were you regular pioneer for?
Oh,
You said
okay.
after high school?
Yeah, so I started right out of high school, and then I took a break for a year and a half while I went to nursing school. Um so roughly 10 years, I think. 10ish, 12 years, I think, somewhere in there.
So
Yeah.
long.
My timeline is a little fuzzy because I kind of have these like blocks that are kind of gone. So I kind of have to like sit or like look at pictures really to remember a lot of things.
Okay, it's a long time. Those are the two questions I had. And then, oh, the last question is, what is the relationship like now that you've disassociated yourself with your mom and your two sisters?
So my mom and my sisters, were very, when I left, they were very in, and I knew that they were going to follow the rules. I know, like, sometimes, you know, there are people that, sorry, there's
Okay.
blasting music outside. Sometimes families will bend the rules a little bit, but I knew my family was very much rule followers. So, basically there hasn't been any contact. Only for when my grandmother was when my grandmother was dying, they let me know that, she wasn't doing well. And I did go to the funeral. That was an interesting experience. Yeah, that was interesting. So that was kind of the first time that they had seen me. And I specifically, like, wasn't on camera, but I made sure that my picture was up. And so one of the things I like is I have two nose rings. So and one thing about being in foreign language is when you leave, sometimes it takes a while for word to get back to English. And so especially with COVID and everything that was going on, there were a lot of people here in Rochester that didn't know I left. In fact, there's two sisters outside that do cart witnessing. And so this is kind of like a visual that I am not a witness anymore. And it's led to some very kind of humorous interactions with people. They see me, recognize me, and then I see them look at my nose, and it's like, ah, yeah. And, I'll still, wave and say hi. I mean, I know, they can't talk to me, but one of the things that's important for me is for people to know that when you leave, your life doesn't fall apart because you left witnesses. It falls apart because we're not equipped to deal with life outside of witnesses. So, kind of go between making my Instagram and my social media private versus not private, because sometimes I'm like, oh, they don't deserve to know what's going on in my life. But then other times I'm like, I want them to see that I'm happy. I'm the happiest I've ever been. I'm actually engaged to a absolutely wonderful gem of a man. And it's like I want them to know that, my life has continued and has blossoming. So I wonder if they look. I kind of hope they do, because I want them to see I'm just fine. You know,
Is there anything you wanted to add to this interview after all of that, Janine? I think this was such a great interview with you sharing so much about things that have happened to you in your life as over a decade of being a regular pioneer with two foreign language congregations.
yeah. I think one of the things that's important too is to not demonize the individual people that are still witnesses. Um, I as much as I wish I wasn't, raised in a cult and or a high control religion, whatever you want to call it. Um, I think my parents really were trying to do the best they knew how. Um, I don't think that they did do the best they could, but um, that's, that is what it is. And I think there are still really good people that happen to be witnesses. There's good people that are witnesses, there's good people that are not witnesses. There's very bad people that are witnesses, and there's very bad people that are not witnesses. One of the things I didn't really talk about was the interactions I've had with the issue with CSA and the religion. So I'll like put them all like briefly together. I don't know if you want to include this or not. I
Sure.
realized I forgot to talk about it. So when I was a child, I was young. I don't remember how old I was, but I was really young. The hall I was in had a lot of children. There was a lot of kids, and there was a family that moved in. It was a blended family, I believe, and the father ended up molesting a lot of his kids and other kids. He was a very prolific child abuser. And when it came out, obviously it was in the news because it was a very big case. And of course, they said he was a witness because he was. And I remember at that time, the sentiment wasn't, oh, that's so awful. I mean, there was people that said, yeah, that was an awful thing. But the most awful thing was it brought reproach on Jehovah's name. And I remember even as a kid, I was like, how could that be the worst part of this? Like, how about all the people's lives that he like affected, you know? And then also in my family, one of my great uncles had been an elder for decades, and he too had abused a lot of children and continued to be an elder. And nothing ever happened to him. And it was always kind of like the open secret, don't be alone with him, don't let him touch you. I remember the first time I had met him, he wanted to buy me an ice cream sandwich or something, and ice cream sandwiches are one of my favorite desserts. And it was my one of my cousins or a great aunt. I'm not exactly sure what my relationship to her was, or like what family tie was. She like yanked me away and was like, don't you ever let him do anything for you. And at the time I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't until I was an adult and some people that he had abused confided in me about the abuse that I knew why she was like that. And so it was kind of like, why can't I'm thankful that she protected me, and she actually was not a witness. So it was like my witness family didn't necessarily protect me, didn't warn us because they knew we were going to be around him. And then when I had just joined French, um, we were still part of an English congregation, and there was a brother in that congregation that again was known to abuse children. And I had known this since I was had moved to Rochester because I had friends that were in that hall, and basically it was kind of like the open secret. And but it had gotten to that point when I joined Russian in 20 or French in 2012, I guess there had been some additional issues with him. And they had gave a talk from the platform talking about how they had given him a set of rules and he wasn't following those rules. And basically, he wasn't allowed to go in service with children. He wasn't allowed to sit next to children. He wasn't, he had to come late, leave early. They, basically listed out all the rules they'd given him and said that he wasn't following them. It wasn't necessarily a marketing talk. It wasn't necessarily a disfellowshipping. It wasn't, and at the end of the talk, it was like, if you don't know who we're talking about, ask a friend or ask an elder, So it was like, it sounds like they were trying to protect people, but really it's like, okay, well, if he's still in the congregation, how is this really protecting people? And in the hall, there were a lot of, single parent households. There were a lot of, children that were coming in as witnesses on their own. So, they were kind of, basically taken under the wing of somebody else. Um, and then ironically, like I want to say maybe a year or two later, I was in service and we went to a house that was in our territory. It was on our French territory. And there he was with the young brother, and the kids of the house were home. And, I happened to be with an elder. I don't know what happened after that, but I was fully awake at that point. And I was like, at that point, I didn't know the scope of the issues with CSA among witnesses, because one of the things that I forgot to talk about this. One of the things I specifically did was I did not watch um, XJW content. Once I woke up and once I disassociated, again, I specifically didn't watch XJW content simply because I wanted to think for myself. I had gone so long with people telling me what to believe. I really didn't want any other influences telling me, well, you shouldn't believe this because X, Y, and Z, and this doesn't make sense because X, Y, and Z. I wanted to come up with that on my own, and that was, I think, one of the big core memories. And of course, I learned about the envelopes, and then kind of tying a lot of different information and experiences that I had had in my life. It kind of tied everything together. It's like, oh, that's why that happened. That's why this person, you know, you kind of like make those connections that maybe when you're younger you didn't quite make. Um, but yeah, that was, I still think back to that talk, and I still wonder, with all of the how often talks like that happen. I would love to know. I don't think there's any numbers on that, but it was a unique experience, and I don't know um, if that's happened in other halls or how often it happens. I think it probably did help some people, because I think, again, you don't talk about it because they're not disfellowshipped, because there's no two witnesses. So, they're just, lurking in the congregations. And so I kind of hope that it did maybe protect some kids that were in the congregation. Obviously, it didn't protect all of them, or that talk wouldn't have been given.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, they can do more. More is needed. That is not sufficient in any way, shape, or form. But I wonder how much they use that avenue of, we're going to protect the children, because that's one of the things that could help.
Yeah,
Wouldn't solve it, but it could help.
definitely. Yeah, CSA, child sex abuse is so big in the organization, and no one talks about it in the organization. They claim
Yeah,
it's a clean
and it
organization and blaming all the other religions.
yeah, I was going to say, it's not, unique to witnesses. There's a big push to, remove the protection that pastors or religious clergy have when it comes to confessions and confessionals, and things like that, because they kind of can hide behind the legalese and legality of, well, we don't have to, we don't have to disclose, but at the same time, yeah, you may not have to, but what is the moral thing? Legal, laws, that's just laws. What's the correct thing to do? What is, the moral thing? I think a lot of, religions and witnesses in particular, pride themselves on having these, high morals, and but when it comes to this one area, it's like all morality just goes out the window.
Mhm.
There is no, it's, oh, we have to rely on we have to rely on, the law,
Mm,
instead of, why don't we do what's correct? Why don't we do what's right? Why don't we do what's, you know, loving to, the most vulnerable members of the group?
mm. Yeah, I totally understand. Again, Janine, thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for being so vulnerable and so honest about all the different things that you did share about. And I think that is it. So I just want to say thank you again for watching this interview if you've made it this far, and until next time.